Dad, we already talked about this. My son said over the phone while I stood alone in the grocery store bakery, holding a birthday cake that said Happy 76th, Dad in blue frosting. The kids are exhausted. I remember tightening my grip on that little plastic cake box and saying, Michael, it's just dinner. Just a couple hours. He let out this long sigh like I was asking him to move mountains. Then I heard Karen in the background laughing about something before she said, loud enough for me to hear, tell him we're not doing another guilt trip tonight. That word sat in my chest the entire drive home. Guilt trip. Like wanting to see your family on your birthday was some kind of manipulation. I still bought the cake anyway. I still stopped by Miller's butcher shop and picked up the ribeye steaks Michael used to beg me to grill every summer when he was a teenager. I still cleaned the whole house top to bottom, even though my knees were aching so bad I had to sit down twice while vacuuming the hallway. Maybe that sounds pathetic. Maybe it was. But when you get old enough, you start holding on to small things harder than you should. A birthday dinner, a phone call, the sound of your grandkids running through the house. Those things become everything. Before I continue, if this story speaks to your heart, or if you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, I'd appreciate it if you liked the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And tell me where you're watching from along with your local time. I always read those comments late at night when the house gets quiet. My name is Harold Bennett. I'm 76 years old, and the night my family abandoned me on my birthday was the night everything in our family finally broke for good. But to understand how it got that bad, I need to take you back to the beginning of that evening because there was one moment I still can't stop thinking about. Around 6 o'clock, I called Michael one more time. You still coming? I asked. There was silence for a second. Then he said, Dad, Karen thinks it might be better if we skip tonight. I laughed a little because honestly I thought he was joking. Skip your father's birthday? I said, come on. Another silence. Then he lowered his voice. She says every time we come over, you make everybody uncomfortable. I didn't even know what to say to that. I just stood there in my kitchen staring at 6 empty chairs while the oven timer beeped behind me. Uncomfortable how? I finally asked. You always bring up Mom, he muttered. That one hit me harder than I expected. My wife had been dead for 8 years. 8 years. And apparently even saying her name now counted as ruining the mood. Michael, I said quietly, your mother lived in this house for 43 years. He sounded irritated now. Dad, this is what I mean. Everything gets heavy with you. Heavy. That was the word they used for grief now. Like missing someone was some bad habit I refused to quit. I told him dinner would be ready by 7 if they changed their minds. Then I hung up before he could hear my voice cracking. At 7:15, the steaks were getting cold. At 7:40, the candles had melted halfway down. By 8 o'clock, I finally stopped pretending every pair of headlights outside belonged to my family. The only sound in the house was the grandfather clock in the hallway and the low hum of the refrigerator. Then my phone buzzed. For one stupid second, my heart jumped. I thought maybe Michael was apologizing. Instead, it was a Facebook notification. Michael Bennett posted a new photo. I clicked it. My son, Karen, Ethan, Lily, all smiling around a bonfire at a lake house 2 hours north of here. Karen had her arm around Michael. The kids were roasting marshmallows. And underneath the photo, my son wrote 5 words that changed something inside me forever. Away from drama. Family time. I must have read that sentence 20 times. Drama. That's what I was now. Not dad. Not grandpa. Just drama. I sat there at the table staring at that picture while the birthday candles burned themselves out one by one. And that's when I finally noticed something that should have terrified my son years earlier. Every single piece of property his family depended on was still legally mine. The thing about being treated like a burden is that it usually does not happen all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, one little moment at a time until one day you realize your own family talks around you instead of to you. After I saw that photo online, I sat in the dark kitchen for a long time thinking about all the things I ignored over the years because I wanted peace more than respect. I remembered the Christmas 3 years earlier when Karen walked into my house carrying store-bought pies and immediately started criticizing everything. This place smells old, she said while opening windows in the middle of December. My wife had died only a few months before that Christmas, and I had barely touched anything in the house since her funeral. Her coat was still hanging by the front door. Her reading glasses still sat beside the recliner. Karen looked around like she was inspecting a motel room. Michael, she whispered loudly enough for me to hear. Your father cannot keep living like this forever. I pretended not to notice. That became a habit of mine. Pretending. Pretending the comments did not hurt. Pretending Karen rolling her eyes every time I mentioned my wife was normal. Pretending my son was still the same little boy who used to sit beside me on the tailgate of my truck eating vanilla ice cream after Little League games. Back then, Michael used to tell people I was his hero. I still remember one summer night, when he was about 10 years old. We were sitting on the dock behind the lake property after fishing all afternoon. He looked up at me and said, "Dad, when I grow up, I want a house right next to yours." That sentence stayed with me for decades, maybe longer than it should have. So when he got married and money became tight years later, I helped them. I helped them every single time. Their first apartment deposit? Me. Karen's medical bills after Ethan was born? Me. When Michael lost his sales job during the recession, I covered their mortgage for almost 11 months. I never held it over his head. Not once. But something changed after Karen started spending more time online comparing their life to everybody else's. Suddenly, the old family house was not charming anymore. It was outdated. The lake property was not peaceful anymore. It was valuable. I remember overhearing her one afternoon in my own kitchen while she thought I was outside. Honestly, she told Michael, your dad sitting on all this property is selfish at this point. Selfish. I nearly dropped the toolbox in my hands when I heard that. Michael did not even argue with her. He just said, he is old-fashioned. He thinks holding on to things keeps mom alive somehow. I stood there frozen beside the garage door listening to my own son reduce 43 years of marriage into clutter. After that, little things started happening more often. Family trips nobody told me about. Birthdays celebrated at restaurants while I got photos afterward instead of invitations. One Thanksgiving, I drove 40 minutes carrying a pecan pie I spent all morning baking only for Karen to open the door halfway and say, "Oh, we thought you were not coming." There were already plates on the table inside. Everyone had started eating without me. I should have left right then. Instead, I smiled and handed her the pie like some neighbor dropping off mail. The worst part was the kids started learning from them. Ethan used to love coming fishing with me. Then one day he looked up from his phone and said, "Dad says you get sad too much, Grandpa." He said it casually, like repeating weather. I told him, "Your dad is probably just worried about me." But deep down I knew something ugly had already settled into that family long before my birthday dinner. And sitting there alone that night staring at those burned-out candles, I finally started wondering if Karen and Michael had been planning something behind my back for a lot longer than I realized. The strange thing is, none of this really started with the birthday dinner. That night only forced me to finally see what had been happening for years. Looking back now, I think the real shift happened after my health scare 2 summers earlier. I had collapsed in the hardware store parking lot during a heat wave in July. Nothing dramatic. Just dehydration and exhaustion, according to the doctor. But when you are 74 years old and end up in a hospital bed with wires taped to your chest, your family suddenly starts talking about your future like you are not in the room anymore. I still remember waking up and hearing Karen whispering near the window, "Michael, we need to start thinking realistically." She sounded calm, practical, like she was discussing grocery lists. "Your dad cannot manage all this property forever." Michael rubbed his forehead and said, "I know." Then Karen glanced over at me sleeping and lowered her voice even more. "If we wait too long, the taxes alone are going to destroy us." Destroy us. That was the first time I realized they were already talking about my home, my land, my workshop, like it belonged to them. A week after I got discharged, Michael started coming around more often. At first it almost felt nice. He helped fix the fence near the west pasture. He brought Ethan over one Saturday to clean out the old fishing shed. For a little while, I actually thought maybe the hospital scare reminded him I was still his father. One afternoon we sat on the porch drinking iced tea while cicadas screamed from the trees. Michael looked around the property and smiled. "This place is worth a fortune now," he said. I shrugged. "Maybe. Never cared much about that." He laughed. "Well, Karen definitely does." Then he added something that sat wrong with me immediately. "You should really think about putting everything into a family trust while things are still simple." Simple. Funny word. Because nothing ever stays simple once money enters a family. I told him I already had a will, and that was enough for now. His whole expression changed after that. Not angry exactly. More disappointed. Like I had refused him something he already considered his. A few days later, Karen came over carrying coffee from that expensive place she liked downtown. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, smiling in a way that felt rehearsed. "Harold," she said softly, "we just worry about you." I nodded slowly. "I appreciate that." She leaned forward. "Managing multiple properties at your age must be exhausting." There it was again. My age. Always my age. I asked her what she was really trying to say. She hesitated before finally saying, "Well, if something happened to you, unexpectedly, probate could take forever. The kids could lose everything. The kids. Not you might lose your father. Not Michael might lose his dad. Just property. Just assets." I looked at her for a long moment and realized something uncomfortable. Karen never talked about this house like it was my home. She talked about it like an investment portfolio waiting for transfer papers. After that conversation, little comments started slipping out more openly. Maybe it is time to downsize. A retirement community would be safer. This property is too much responsibility for one person. Even Ethan accidentally repeated one of Karen's lines during dinner one night. "Mom says Grandpa is basically land rich." Everybody laughed except me. What none of them realized was that I had already started noticing things they thought I was too old to catch. The private conversation stopping when I walked into rooms. Michael suddenly asking detailed questions about deeds and taxes. Karen photographing parts of the property on her phone when she thought I was not looking. And then one evening, completely by accident, I overheard a conversation that made my stomach turn cold because for the first time, I realized they were not just waiting for me to die anymore. They were planning for it. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in early October. I remember because the air smelled like dry leaves and somebody nearby was burning wood. Michael and Karen had come over for dinner with the kids, and for most of the evening, everything felt strangely normal. Karen even complimented the pot roast. Ethan showed me pictures from football practice. Lily sat beside me coloring at the kitchen table while humming softly to herself. For a few hours, I let myself believe maybe I had imagined all the tension. Maybe families just went through rough seasons sometimes. Around 7:30, Michael asked if he could borrow my truck to pick up ice cream from the grocery store because Karen had forgotten dessert. I handed him the keys without thinking twice. About 10 minutes later, I realized my reading glasses were still inside the truck console. My eyes had been getting worse lately, especially at night. I stepped outside toward the driveway expecting them to still be there because the truck had barely enough gas to make it into town and back. But halfway down the porch steps, I heard voices from the side of the garage. Michael and Karen had not left yet. They were standing near the tool shed talking quietly. At first I was about to call out to them. Then I heard Karen say my name. "You need to stop waiting around," she whispered sharply. "Your father is never going to hand this over willingly." I froze right there beside the porch rail. Michael sounded nervous. "Keep your voice down." Karen scoffed. "I am serious, Michael. We have wasted 2 years already." 2 years. I remember feeling something tighten in my chest hearing that number. This was not some recent concern after my hospital stay. They had been discussing me for years. Michael rubbed the back of his neck the way he always did when stressed. "I just do not want him thinking we are after his money." Karen laughed quietly. "Michael, your father has millions tied up in property and acts like he is broke because he shops at hardware stores instead of country clubs. Millions." Hearing my life reduced to numbers by people I loved felt uglier than I can explain. Then Karen said something that made my stomach drop completely. "Honestly, if he moves into assisted living now, we could avoid probate headaches later." Assisted living. I was standing 20 feet away holding a coffee mug while they discussed where to put me like I was furniture nobody wanted anymore. Michael stayed quiet for several seconds before finally saying, "He is still independent." Karen crossed her arms. "For now, I do not think I have ever felt loneliness hit me the way it did in that moment. Not when my wife died. Not sitting alone at the hospital. Not even on my birthday. Because this was different. This was betrayal wearing the face of concern. I stepped backward before they could see me and went inside through the laundry room. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the mug into the sink. A few minutes later, they walked back and smiling like nothing happened. "Dad," Michael said casually, "you want chocolate or vanilla ice?" "Cream." I stared at him for a second too long. "Vanilla is fine," I said quietly. Karen tilted her head studying me. "You feeling okay, Harold?" There it was again. That fake softness. That careful little performance. I nodded and forced a smile because suddenly I understood something important. They did not think I noticed any of this. They thought age made people blind. The rest of dinner felt surreal after that. Ethan was talking about football schedules while Michael discussed interest rates, and Karen asked suspiciously specific questions about property taxes. "Have you updated your will recently?" she asked while cutting her steak. I looked directly at her and said, "Why?" She smiled without blinking. "Just trying to help." That night after they finally left, I walked through the house turning off lights one room at a time. My wife's photo still sat on the piano in the living room. I stopped there for a long moment staring at her smile. Then I quietly opened the desk drawer beneath the lamp and pulled out the folder none of them knew existed. And after what I overheard outside that garage, I finally decided it was time to read every single page inside. The folder inside that desk drawer was older than Ethan. Thick manila paper, worn corners, my wife Margaret's handwriting still clipped to the front from years ago. Estate documents, property records, insurance information. Things we organized together back when we still believed family meant permanence. I sat at the kitchen table until almost 2 in the morning reading every page under the yellow light above the stove, while the untouched birthday cake sat beside me slowly drying out. The deeper I got into those papers, the more I realized how much trust one had handed people who no longer saw me as a person. Margaret and I had structured everything carefully years ago after one of our friends lost his property during a messy inheritance fight. Every deed, every account, every acre of land, everything remained solely under my control unless I personally transferred ownership. Michael did not know that. Karen definitely did not know that. For days after overhearing them outside the garage, I kept hoping maybe I misunderstood the conversation. Maybe grief and loneliness had twisted things in my head. So I tried reaching out. I really did. The next Monday morning, I called Michael while drinking coffee at the kitchen counter. It went to voicemail. "Hey, buddy," I said after the beep. "Just wanted to check in. Maybe we could have lunch sometime this week. Just us." No response. Tuesday night, I texted him a photo I found of us holding fish at the lake when he was 12 years old. I wrote, "Found this while cleaning today. Still one of my favorite days." He reacted with a thumbs up emoji 6 hours later. That was it. No call. No conversation. Just a little digital hand from the son I once carried on my shoulders through Disney World because his feet hurt. Karen started texting more after that, strangely enough. But every message felt calculated. "Do you need help organizing your medications? Have you considered hiring someone to maintain the property? You should not overwork yourself at your age." At first glance it sounded caring. But once you hear the truth behind someone's voice, you cannot unhear it. One afternoon, I decided to drive over to Michael's house unannounced. I had not done that in years because Karen hated drop-ins. I brought Ethan the tackle box I promised him months earlier. The same green, metal one Michael used as a kid. When I knocked, Karen opened the door only halfway. "Oh," she said flatly. "You should have called." I held up the tackle box awkwardly. "Just wanted to drop this off for Ethan." She did not invite me inside. I could hear everybody eating dinner in the kitchen. Plates clinking. Television running somewhere in the background. My own family 10 feet away from me. Ethan appeared behind her and smiled when he saw the tackle box. "Grandpa," he said excitedly. But before he could step forward, Karen touched his shoulder lightly and said, "Honey, we are in the middle of dinner." Something about the way she said it made me feel like a salesman interrupting strangers. Michael finally walked over wiping his hands with a dish towel. "Dad," he said quietly. "You really need to start calling first." I stared at him for a second because I honestly could not believe what I was hearing. "I used to have my own key to this house," I said before I could stop myself. Karen crossed her arms immediately. "And boundaries are healthy now." Boundaries. Funny word considering how deeply they were already reaching into my life behind my back. I handed Ethan the tackle box and told him maybe we could still go fishing before winter came. He looked at his parents before answering. "Maybe," he said softly. I drove home with this strange hollow feeling in my chest that only got worse when I checked Facebook later that night and saw photos Karen posted from dinner. "Perfect family night," the caption said. Perfect family. Everyone smiling around the table. Everyone except me. After that, the phone call stopped almost completely. Invitations disappeared. Even holidays became quiet. Some nights I would sit in my recliner staring at the television without hearing a single word because all I could think about was how somebody can spend 40 years building a family and still end up feeling like an outsider in his own bloodline. And somewhere deep down, beneath all that loneliness, something inside me had finally started changing. Winter came early that year, the kind of cold that settles into old houses and makes every room feel larger than it really is. I started keeping the television on at night just to hear another voice in the house. Some evenings I would catch myself setting out 2 coffee mugs in the morning before remembering Margaret had been gone for 8 years. Grief does strange things when loneliness starts piling on top of it. Around Thanksgiving, Michael called for the first time in almost 3 weeks. His voice sounded distracted. "Hey Dad, listen, we are doing dinner at Karen's sister's place this year." I stood at the kitchen sink looking out at the frozen backyard while snow drifted against the fence line. "Oh," I said quietly. "I already bought the turkey." He sighed immediately like I had become another problem to manage. "Dad, come on. We talked about this." "No," I answered softly. "You talked." I listened. There was silence on the line for a second. Then Karen's voice appeared faintly in the background, asking, "Is he making this difficult again?" Michael lowered his voice. "Maybe we can stop by after dessert." Stop by? Like I was some elderly neighbor they felt obligated to check on for 15 minutes during the holidays. I told him not to worry about it. Then I hung up before my voice gave out on me. Thanksgiving morning, I still cooked anyway. Habit, I guess. I made mashed potatoes, stuffing, sweet carrots with brown sugar, all the things Margaret used to put on the table every year. By 3 in the afternoon, the whole house smelled like sage and butter and roasted turkey. And by 6 o'clock, I was eating alone in complete silence except for the sound of forks against china. At one point, I looked up from my plate because I honestly thought I heard Margaret laughing in the living room. That is when it hit me how quiet a house can become when the people inside it stop loving each other properly. A few weeks later, I slipped on ice outside near the barn and twisted my shoulder badly enough that I could barely lift my arm. I sat in the truck for almost 20 minutes debating whether to call Michael because I already knew how the conversation would feel. But eventually I dialed anyway. He answered, sounding irritated. "Dad, I am in a meeting. I just need a ride to urgent care," I said. There was a pause. Then he asked, "Can you call an Uber?" An Uber. I remember staring through the windshield at the snow falling across the pasture while something inside me finally gave way. Not anger. Not even sadness exactly. Just exhaustion. Deep exhaustion. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I can do that." That night, I came home with my arm in a sling and found a voicemail from Karen. "Harold, maybe this is a sign you should seriously think about assisted living before something worse happens." No concern about whether I was hurt. No asking if I made it home safely. Just another reminder that my independence inconvenienced them. Christmas passed the same way. A gift basket left on my porch with a printed card instead of handwritten signatures. Ethan texted me, "Merry Christmas, Grandpa," at almost midnight. Lily forgot entirely. I do not blame the children. Kids learn what love looks like from the adults around them. The hardest night came in January during a power outage after a snowstorm knocked lines down across half the county. I sat wrapped in blankets beside the fireplace listening to wind hit the windows while the house creaked around me. At some point around 2 in the morning, I realized nobody had called to check if I was warm, safe, or even alive. Not my son. Not my grandchildren. Nobody. I sat there staring into the fire thinking about how a man can spend his whole life building security for his family and still end up completely alone inside it. But somewhere in that silence, with snow falling outside and the fire slowly dying down in front of me, another feeling started replacing the loneliness. For the first time in years, I stopped asking myself how to hold my family together, and I started asking something very different. The next morning, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I made a decision without thinking about how my family would feel about it first. I drove into town before sunrise with a thermos of coffee sitting beside me in the truck and stopped outside a small diner near the marina. The place opened at 5:30 every morning for fishermen and construction crews. Margaret and I used to eat there years ago before life got complicated. I sat in the corner booth watching steam rise off my coffee while snow melted against the windows. After a while, the waitress looked over and smiled gently. "You okay, honey?" she asked. Funny how strangers sometimes notice your pain faster than family does. I nodded and said, "Yeah, just thinking." Her name was Denise. Somewhere in her 60s. Short gray hair. Wore reading glasses around her neck. She refilled my coffee twice without charging me for it. "You retired?" she asked eventually. Supposedly, I said. She laughed. Men like you never really retire. That sentence stayed with me the whole drive home. For the first time in years, I started noticing how much of my life had shrunk down into waiting. Waiting for phone calls. Waiting for holidays. Waiting for people who treated me like an obligation. And once I noticed it, I could not unsee it anymore. So I started changing small things quietly. I repaired the old fishing boat sitting behind the barn instead of letting it rot under a tarp. I cleaned out the workshop Michael had not stepped inside for almost 2 years. I started waking up earlier, cooking real meals again. One Saturday morning, I drove down to the marina and ended up helping a younger guy named Travis fix a cracked trailer axle because he was struggling alone in the parking lot. "You know what you were doing," he said while wiping grease off his hands. I shrugged. "Spent 40 years building houses. You pick things up." By the end of the afternoon, he offered me part-time work helping renovate old lake cabins nearby. Not because I needed the money, but because for the first time in a long time, somebody looked at me like I still had value beyond what I owned. A few weeks later, I was spending 3 days a week near the lake helping rebuild decks, repair docks, replace drywall damaged by winter storms. Hard work. Honest work. My shoulders still hurt sometimes, and my knees complained every time I climbed ladders. But at night, I slept better than I had in years. One afternoon, while measuring lumber near the shoreline, Travis asked, "So where is your family during all this?" I stared out across the frozen water for a second before answering. "Busy, I guess." He nodded slowly like he understood more than I said. The strange part was Michael barely noticed the changes at first. Weeks would pass without hearing from him. Then suddenly he would text asking random questions. "Did you renew the property insurance? You still planning to keep the lake lot? Have you thought any more about simplifying things?" Simplifying. That word again. But now when I read those messages, I did not feel hurt the same way anymore. I started feeling clear. One evening, Michael finally called after nearly a month of silence. "Dad," he said carefully, "Karen thinks maybe you are overworking yourself lately." I laughed quietly while standing in my workshop covered in sawdust. "Funny," I said. "Nobody seemed worried about me when I was sitting alone in the dark all winter." He went silent immediately. Then he said, "You always make things sound worse than they are." I looked around the workshop at the tools I bought with decades of labor, the framed photo of Margaret hanging near the workbench, the old radio softly playing country music in the background. "No, Michael," I said calmly. "I think I just finally started seeing things the way they really are." After that call, I noticed something interesting. The more independent I became, the more nervous my son started sounding. And by spring, another opportunity was about to walk into my life that neither Michael nor Karen saw coming. By the time spring settled over the lake, people started knowing my name again. Not because of what I owned, because of what I could do. Travis introduced me to more contractors around the marina, and before long, I was helping oversee repairs on 3 different cabin properties damaged during winter storms. Most of the crews were younger guys in their 30s and 40s, but after a few weeks, they stopped treating me like some retired old man tagging along for exercise. One morning, I walked onto a job site wearing my old tan work jacket with Bennett Construction stitched across the chest pocket, and one of the electricians looked at me and said, "Wait, Bennett Construction? You built half the houses around this county." I laughed a little. Maybe not half. But the truth was, back in the 80s and 90s, my company really had built a lot of this town. Schools, lake cabins, grocery stores, whole neighborhoods. I had just forgotten who I used to be because somewhere along the way I became more focused on being needed by my family than being respected by myself. Around that same time, Travis offered me something unexpected. We were standing near a dock at sunrise reviewing plans for a property expansion when he handed me a navy blue work shirt folded neatly inside plastic packaging. "What is this?" I asked. "Company uniform," he said casually. "You are officially on payroll now." I stared at the stitched name above the pocket for a second. Harold Bennett, Site Supervisor. I know that probably sounds small to younger people, but after years of being treated fragile, dramatic, inconvenient, seeing that title hit me harder than I expected. Nobody had looked at me with confidence in a very long time. A few days later, I stopped by the diner after work still wearing the uniform shirt. Denise spotted the name tag immediately and smiled. "Look at you," she said while pouring coffee. "Back in charge again." I smiled for the first time in months without forcing it. "Feels strange," I admitted. Strange good or strange bad? She asked. I looked down at my rough hands wrapped around the coffee mug. Strange, like I forgot I still existed outside my family. The work changed me quietly. I stood straighter, slept better. Even my doctor noticed during a checkup in April. Blood pressure looks better than last year, he said while reviewing charts. Whatever you are doing, keep doing it. The funniest part was Michael suddenly started reaching out more often once he realized I was busy without him. He called one afternoon while I was reviewing lumber deliveries near the marina. Dad, where have you been lately? He asked. Working, I answered simply. He sounded surprised. Working? Turns out I still know how to use a hammer. He laughed awkwardly, but there was tension underneath it. Then he asked something that immediately caught my attention. You still planning to hold on to all the properties long term? There it was again, always circling back to ownership, to assets, to inheritance. I leaned against the truck and watched seagulls drift over the water before answering. Why? Michael hesitated. No reason, just curious. But people are rarely curious about things they already think belong to them. A few weeks later, I attended a Marina Association dinner with Travis and some contractors from neighboring counties. Nothing fancy. Folding tables, fried catfish, cheap beer. But for the first time in years, I spent an evening around people who listened when I spoke. One developer from Nashville even shook my hand afterward and said, "You have a good eye for land value, Harold. If you ever think about selling anything near the lake, call me first." Selling. Funny word. Because for the first time, the idea did not upset me. In fact, driving home that night with the windows cracked and warm spring air blowing through the truck, I started thinking about something I had not seriously considered before. What if the life I spent years protecting was already gone? And if it was gone, what exactly was I still holding on to? By the time my 76th birthday finally arrived that summer, I already knew the answer to that question. My family just did not realize it yet. By the night of my 76th birthday, the decision had already been made. Nobody at that dinner table knew it because nobody actually came to that dinner table. But sitting there alone in that quiet house, staring at those burned-out candles and that Facebook post calling me drama, I finally understood something I should have realized years earlier. My family had already emotionally left me long before they physically stopped showing up. The birthday dinner only stripped away the last illusion. Around 9:30 that night, my phone finally rang. Michael. I looked at the screen for a long moment before answering. Hey, Dad, he said casually, like he was calling after being 10 minutes late instead of abandoning his father on his birthday. In the background, I could hear laughter, splashing water, music playing faintly somewhere near the lake house. We might swing by tomorrow instead, he added. Swing by. I stared at the untouched cake sitting in front of me. You already had family time, I said quietly. He sighed immediately. Dad, do not start. There was that phrase again. Do not start. As if my disappointment was the problem instead of their behavior. Karen thought it would be healthier if we avoided unnecessary stress tonight. Healthier. I almost laughed hearing that word while sitting alone in a dark dining room built with 40 years of my own labor. Michael, I asked slowly, when did I become something your family needed protecting from? Silence. Then he said something that changed everything for good. You make people feel guilty just by existing sometimes. I honestly do not think he understood how cruel that sentence sounded. Maybe that is the worst part. He said it naturally, comfortably, like something Karen had repeated often enough that he started believing it himself. I looked around the dining room after he hung up. Margaret's china cabinet. The old oak table I refinished by hand in 1989. Family photos lining the wall from vacations nobody remembered except me. The whole house suddenly felt less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to people who no longer cared about the man preserving it. The next morning, I drove into town before sunrise and parked outside my attorney's office 20 minutes before they opened. His name was Walter Green, 72 years old, sharp as a knife. He handled our estate planning years earlier when Margaret was still alive. When I walked into his office, he looked up from his desk and frowned slightly. Harold, he said carefully, you look tired. I sat down slowly across from him. I am done waiting for my family to love me correctly, I answered. Walter studied my face for a few seconds before asking, what exactly are you here to do? I slid the property folder across his desk. I want options. For nearly 2 hours we reviewed everything. The family house, the lake property, the vacant lots near the marina, the workshop land. Walter adjusted his glasses several times while flipping through paperwork. Legally, he said finally, everything is entirely yours. Nobody else has claim to any of it unless you choose otherwise. Hearing those words out loud did something to me. For years my family treated my future death like an upcoming transfer date. But legally and morally, none of them owned any part of my life. Walter leaned back in his chair carefully. Harold, he asked quietly, are you trying to punish your family? I looked out the office window toward Main Street, where people were opening shops for the morning. No, I said after a long pause. I think I am finally trying to save what is left of myself. Over the next few weeks, I started putting certain things into motion quietly. Meetings, paperwork, appraisals, calls from developers interested in waterfront property. Nobody in my family noticed because they were too busy assuming the future already belonged to them. Then one evening near the end of August, Michael unexpectedly showed up at my house unannounced. And judging by the expression on his face when I opened the door, somebody had finally discovered that something was changing. Michael stood on my porch looking uneasy in a way I had never seen before. Not angry, not confident, uneasy. He kept glancing past me into the house like he was searching for something. Dad, he said carefully, why did a real estate developer call me asking if the lake property was being subdivided? I opened the screen door wider and stepped aside. You might as well come in. He walked into the kitchen slowly while I poured coffee into 2 mugs. The same kitchen where Margaret used to bake birthday cakes for him every August. The same kitchen where he once sat at 16 years old crying after his first breakup while I told him heartbreak passes eventually. Funny how life works. Some heartbreaks do not pass. Some just get quieter. Michael sat down at the table while I slid the mug toward him. Dad, he said again, what is going on? I sat across from him calmly. I have been reorganizing things. He frowned immediately. What does that mean? I looked at him for a long moment before answering. It means I spent too many years building my life around people who only valued what I owned. His jaw tightened. That is not fair. No, I said softly. What was not fair was spending my 76th birthday alone while my family posted pictures about escaping drama. He looked away immediately after that. That told me everything. He remembered the post. He remembered every word of it. Karen did not mean it like that, he muttered. I almost smiled hearing that because excuses always arrive faster than accountability. Then how exactly did she mean it? I asked quietly. Michael rubbed his forehead hard. Dad, you have been distant for months. Interesting, I said, because from where I was sitting, I thought you were the ones disappearing. Silence filled the kitchen after that. The old refrigerator hummed softly behind us. Somewhere outside, wind moved through the trees near the pasture. Michael looked older suddenly. Tired. Walter Green called me yesterday, he admitted finally. That surprised me. Walter never broke confidentiality, which meant Michael must have contacted him first fishing for information. And I asked. Michael swallowed. He said everything is still entirely under your control. There it was. The truth finally landing. Not emotionally. Financially. Legally. Realizing the future he assumed belonged to him was never guaranteed at all. You thought your mother and I already signed everything over years ago, did you not? I asked calmly. He did not answer. He did not need to. I could see it written all over his face. Dad, he said slowly. Karen and I have made plans based on this family property staying in the family. I leaned back in my chair and studied my son carefully. That is the problem, Michael. You stopped thinking about this as my life a long time ago. To you it became inventory. He shook his head immediately. That is not true. Then tell me something, I said quietly. When was the last time you came here just to see me instead of discussing property taxes, retirement, or my future? He opened his mouth, closed it again. I watched him search desperately for an answer that did not exist. Finally he said, we were worried about you. No, I replied softly. You were worried about control. That hit him harder than yelling ever could have. His shoulders dropped slightly after that. For the first time all evening, he looked less defensive and more afraid. Dad, he said carefully, you are not actually thinking about selling anything, are you? I stood up slowly and walked over to the kitchen counter where several folders sat neatly stacked beside the sink. Appraisals, contracts, purchase offers. I placed one of them gently in front of him. He stared down at the paperwork while the color slowly drained from his face. Then he looked back up at me with an expression I will never forget. Not anger, not sadness. Shock. Pure shock. Because in that moment, my son finally realized the quiet old man they spent years dismissing had already made a decision without asking their permission. Michael stared at the paperwork so long I could actually hear the clock ticking above the stove. The purchase offer sat between us on the kitchen table like something dangerous. Finally, he looked up and said, almost in disbelief, "You are serious?" I nodded once. Yes. He pushed the papers back toward me immediately, like touching them burned his hands. Dad, you cannot just sell the lake property. Why not? I asked calmly. Because it has been in the family forever. I almost laughed at that. Forever. Such a powerful word coming from people who could not spare 2 hours for my birthday dinner. The property belongs to me, Michael. It belongs to all of us. He snapped back before catching himself. There it was. The truth finally slipping out without disguise. Not concern for me. Not memories. Ownership. Expectation. I folded the paperwork neatly and placed it back into the folder. No, I said quietly. It never did. He stood up abruptly and started pacing near the living room doorway. I noticed his breathing getting shallow the same way it used to before high school football games. Except this was not fear of losing a game. This was fear of losing certainty. Karen is going to lose her mind over this, he muttered under his breath. Karen already made up her mind about me a long time ago, I answered. He stopped pacing and looked directly at me. You are punishing us. No, I replied calmly. I am finally stopping you from treating my life like an inheritance countdown. He opened his mouth to argue again when the front door suddenly swung open without knocking. Karen walked in carrying her oversized purse with that same controlled expression she always wore whenever she thought she could manage a situation through confidence alone. Michael, why are you not answering your phone? She asked before noticing me sitting at the table. Then she saw the folder. Her eyes narrowed immediately. What is that? Michael looked trapped for half a second before quietly saying, Dad is selling property. Karen blinked once. Excuse me. I stayed seated while she marched toward the kitchen table. Harold, she said carefully. Surely there is some misunderstanding here. No misunderstanding, I answered. I am restructuring my future. She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. By liquidating family assets. They are my assets, I corrected gently. That sentence changed the atmosphere instantly. I watched the exact moment politeness disappeared from her face. You are being emotional, she said sharply. After everything Michael has done for you. I stared at her quietly for a few seconds because honestly that sentence amazed me. Done for me, I repeated softly. Karen crossed her arms. We have supported you for years. Supported me. I looked around the kitchen my own hands built 40 years earlier. The kitchen where I paid every bill, every repair, every tax payment. Karen, I said calmly, you once left me alone on Thanksgiving because stopping by my house was inconvenient. Michael immediately stepped in. Dad, come on. No, I said without raising my voice. You both need to hear this now. Silence filled the room. Even Karen stopped moving. I spent years convincing myself your behavior came from stress, busy schedules, parenting, work. But the truth is much simpler than that. I looked directly at my son. You stopped seeing me as family the moment I became more valuable to you as property than as a father. Michael looked genuinely wounded hearing that, but neither of them denied it. That silence told me everything. Karen finally pulled out a chair and sat down slowly. What exactly are you planning to do? She asked cautiously. I folded my hands together on the table. I already sold one parcel near the marina. Michael's face went pale immediately. Karen leaned forward sharply. You did what? And I accepted an offer on the lake property yesterday. The room went completely still after that. I could hear wind tapping branches against the window outside. Michael lowered himself into the chair beside Karen like his legs suddenly weakened beneath him. For the first time since all this began, neither of them looked angry anymore. They looked scared. And somehow, that hurt more than everything else. The strangest thing about losing the version of your family you spent years trying to protect is that eventually, the silence stops hurting the same way. A few months after I sold the lake property, the house felt different. Lighter somehow. Not happier exactly. Just honest. The pretending was finally over. Michael and Karen struggled for a while after the sales went through. Not because I left them homeless like they later told people, but because for the first time in their adult lives, they had to build stability without assuming my life would eventually become their safety net. They downsized into a smaller place closer to town. Karen stopped speaking to me entirely for nearly 6 months. Michael called occasionally, but those conversations sounded different now. Careful, humbled, like a man finally realizing his father was not just some aging obstacle standing between him and a future payout. One afternoon near the beginning of fall, Ethan showed up at the marina unexpectedly. He had grown taller, voice deeper. He stood awkwardly near the dock with his hands in his sweatshirt pockets before finally saying, "Dad told me you sold the fishing cabin." I nodded. I did. He looked out at the water quietly for a few seconds. "I used to really like it there." "Me too," I answered softly. Then he surprised me. "Mom says you got angry and pushed everybody away. But I do not think that is really what happened." Hearing that from my grandson nearly broke my heart all over again because it reminded me how children quietly observe truths adults try to hide. I handed him an old tackle box from beneath the workbench, the same green metal one I gave him years earlier. "You still know how to cast?" I asked. He smiled a little. "Probably." So we spent the afternoon fishing near the marina while the sun dropped low across the water, and for the first time in years, I felt something peaceful settle inside me. Not victory, not revenge, just peace. Michael eventually came around more often too. Slowly, carefully. One evening he sat beside me outside the workshop while I sanded down an old cedar chair Margaret used to love. After almost 10 minutes of silence, he finally said, "I think I stopped seeing you clearly after Mom died." I kept sanding quietly for a moment before answering. "I stopped seeing myself clearly too." He nodded like that answer hurt him somehow. Then he looked at me and said something I had waited years to hear. "I am sorry, Dad. Not for the property, not for the money, for me. For all the birthdays, holidays, hospital visits, and quiet little abandonments that slowly taught me I mattered less than convenience. I wish I could tell you everything became perfect after that, but life does not really work that way. Some damage leaves scars even after healing begins. Karen and I still keep our distance. Certain memories still ache on quiet nights. But I no longer wake up every morning trying to earn love from people who already decided my value for me. These days I spend most mornings near the marina drinking coffee before work starts. I still wear that navy blue shirt with site supervisor stitched across the chest. Sometimes tourists mistake me for the owner. Sometimes younger workers ask for advice about construction, marriage, or life. And every once in a while, I catch myself laughing again without forcing it. I think that matters more than people realize. If there is one thing this whole experience taught me, it is that love without respect slowly turns into grief while people are still alive. Family should not make you feel small for needing connection. And protecting your peace is not cruelty, even when the people hurting you call it selfishness. If someone listening to my story feels invisible inside their own family right now, please hear me when I say this. Do not abandon yourself trying to keep other people comfortable. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Protect your finances. Protect your heart. And never confuse being needed with being loved. Sometimes God, or life, or maybe just your own exhausted soul, pushes you toward loneliness for a season so you finally remember who you were before everybody else started defining your worth. My name is Harold Bennett. I am 76 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is simple. Never give people so much power over your life that you disappear inside it. Thank you for spending this time with me and listening to my story. Truly, I know there are people out there carrying quiet heartbreaks nobody else sees. And if this story made you feel a little less alone tonight, then maybe something good came from all of it after all. If this story meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment sharing where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. And if you want to hear more stories about family, healing, betrayal, second chances, and finding yourself again after life breaks your heart, there are more waiting for you in the playlist. Some of those stories are even more painful than mine, and some end in ways you would never expect.